We'll just give it a minute for folks to join us on the webinar. Okay, hello everyone. A very warm welcome to today's session on the world's first social impact guarantee. I'm Kevin Teo, COO at AVPN, and it's great to have so many of you joining us today. I see we have many AVPN members and stakeholders in today's webinar. So for those of you who might not already be familiar with AVPN, we are Asia's largest social investing network with more than 600 members across 33 countries. And our mission is to move capital towards impact with a strong focus on collaboration and partnership within the ecosystem. Just a few quick housekeeping rules before we jump into the session proper. Firstly, you would have noticed that we have triggered recording for this session, and we'll be making a recording available to all participants and registrants over the next few days. And secondly, we hope to have a truly engaging session with everyone. So please do use the chat box or the Q&A function to share any questions you have with us as we go through today's session flow. And we will definitely set aside some time for Q&A towards the end of today's session to address your questions. To set the stage for today's webinar, many of you know that the first SIP was launched about 10 years ago in 2010, where approximately $8 million USD was raised from 17 trusts and foundations to reduce reoffending among short-term offenders leaving the Peterborough prison. Since then, about 108 impact bonds have been contracted globally. SIPs, or social impact bonds, were more recently adapted into DIBs, development impact bonds, by replacing the government with the external donors. This adaptation has worked well in countries where private donors can play the role typically represented by governments in the SIP setup. For today, we'll be talking about social impact guarantees, or SIGs, another evolution on this innovative finance model. Through the SIG, impact-minded funders are offered a money-back guarantee on their funding, while enabling social service providers to try new innovations. Over the long run, our hope is that SIGs can stimulate a new wave of sophisticated management of impact risk for public, private, and philanthropic funders alike. In today's webinar, we will find out more about the social impact guarantee and how they can be used to help stretch funder dollars and capacity built to amplify social impact. And joining us today, we have three panelists: Pierre Lorinet, Chair of the Lorinet Foundation; Kevin Tan, who is founder CEO of Trisector Associates; and Mara Aioldi, who is Academic Director of the Oxford Government Outcomes Lab. To get this session rolling, I will turn it over to Mara, who will share her screen and provide us some context as to the landscape for the social impact guarantee. Over to you, Mara.
Thank you, Kevin. I hope I'm sharing in the right way.
It's not quite coming up yet. Maybe you can try.
It's not possible. It worked before and now it's not sharing.
Okay, got it.
Can you see it? No.
Yes. Yep.
And is in presenting mode.
If you can go to presenting mode.
Fantastic.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much, Kevin. As Kevin said, I'm the director of the Government Outcomes Lab, and I would like to kick us off by giving an overview of the sector. Kevin already talked a little bit about social impact bond, but just to make sure we are all on the same page and put the work that Kevin from Trisector will present later, let's make sure we are all on the same page. The perspective I bring is the perspective of an academic center. The GoLab is a research center that is based at the University of Oxford, and it was set up as a partnership with the UK government, who has done a lot of innovation in the space of result-based financing with an impact bond focus in particular. So as Kevin was saying in the beginning, the Pittsburgh Social Impact Bond started in 2010, and since then many have been launched in the UK. And the UK government wanted a partner that gathered some of the learning and took a step back as an independent observer about what was happening, and also built some capacity when there were lessons to be learned and transferable skills that could have been used by government, and not necessarily in an impact bond setting, but for instance, being able to use data to inform practice. Can these be used more widely within the public sector? So this is the role that we bring in this sector, and I will speak from this perspective. And to get us all on the same page, impact bonds is a very, very sexy name, and everybody knows it's not a bond. And that has led to a lot of confusion, especially among those among us who have a financial background. The best way to define an impact bond, this is a partnership, is a contract between three different types of agents. This is simplification, but you have people who have a need at the center, and we need to satisfy this need. In order to satisfy this need, we have a provider of services, first actor that comes in. And this provider of services, to have the right incentive, is being paid on results. This creates a problem, because if you are paid on results, how do you finance your staff? And there is an issue of pre-financing. And the outcome payer tends to be either a philanthropic organization or government that pays the provider if results have been achieved. Like, we want to reskill the workforce, and we are gonna pay only if people are in employment. So the service provider who does the reskilling has a pre-financing issue. Here comes investors that provide this money up front. This was the original scheme. So it works that the investor says like, oh, I'll give you the capital to get the project started. The service provider does the project. If there are results, the outcome funder pays back, and money can go back to investor according to the terms. So this is the basic scheme. There has been a lot of activity since 2010. So we host a global data set of impact bonds in particular. And today there are 218 that have been launched all over the world. In the map, we are counting the location. So if you sum up the numbers from the map, it will come up to like 250, because some impact bonds operate in multiple locations. And the pin in the map identifies the delivery location. There is about $500 million of capital raised in dollars, more about 150,000 people being affected. But on average, those instruments are quite small. They are about $1 million, the median project, and they have a target population of about 400 people. So they're not large. And they touch any sector from employment, child and family welfare, homelessness, health, education, criminal justice, and we have agriculture and environment and poverty reduction arriving on in this space. So a lot of activity, still small, and one might think, oh, it's 10 years they've been launched and we have 218. Are they a lot? Depends. Some say this is not growing at the speed that one would have expected. But what is interesting when you look at this instrument, as I said, is a partnership. There are these three players, and there are various box and arrows diagram that describe the flow of capital. But then when you look at each of these instruments, there is a lot of variation. And we identify there is this core SIP at the center of this slide. There are like 4 features that are the textbook example, like a social impact bond. An impact bond has these 4 things. 1, we are paying on outcomes. And if you look at the Pittsburgh one, the original one, all of the payment was predicated on outcomes. We have a high degree of performance management. There is this use of data and active performance management, gathering data in terms of We know what a good outcome is, we know how to measure it, and we have milestones along the way to check that we are moving in the right direction, and there is this use of data to course correct to make sure that we are achieving the outcomes that we have agreed, and we are bringing in new players that have a lot of skills in performance management and bring these competencies to really monitor the progress of the project. Usually, there is an organization with a social intent from the non-for-profit sector doing the service delivery, and there is independent at-risk capital provided by a social investor. This is the definition. This is the Pittsburgh project. Since then, each of these dimensions have been stretched in various ways. So not all impact bonds pay just on outcomes. Some have a minority payment on outcomes. And when do you stop calling it an impact bonds? As long as there is like some financial incentive that is meaningful and is linked on outcome, we consider it an impact bond. But the proportion of the payment that goes on the outcome or on proxy indicators or activities has varied and varies enormously. The degree of performance management, again, varies a lot. In some projects, this is very active and there are weekly meetings. In other projects, it's quarterly. And in other projects, the service provider is left to himself to do the performance management. The organizations that run the services, initially they were just charities, but now we see also large for-profit organizations or maybe social enterprise that are not for profit, but they are not just the charity sector. And what is interesting, there is a diversification of the type of player that bring capital to the table. They have different risk appetite. They work with different type of investors. We have philanthropy, venture philanthropy, social investor, mainstream investor. And the nature of this capital is one of the things that is being innovated most quickly recently. And I think is in this context that the work that three sector is doing with the social impact guarantee sits. Because is it an impact bond? Well, it depends where you draw the scope of the definition, but clearly is in the space of trying to deliver outcome, coming up with a good metric, and there is a great innovation on what is the nature of the capital and who sits around the table. So I'll stop here and I'll hand over to Kevin Tan from Three Sector that will explain the details of this innovation.
Thank you very much, Mara, for setting the scene. It's always a real pleasure to speak with you and have your expertise. And good afternoon or good morning to everybody on this call. So my name is Kevin Tan. I'm the founder of Tri-Sector Associates. And today I'd like to share how I think that the social impact guarantee model can help to take some of the core benefits that Mara described from the social impact bond and take that to even greater scale. A bit about me. I started this journey about 7 years ago, kind of fell into it. I had a chance to do this around the world. So I started off with social finance in Israel. In the US, worked for the Kennedy School Social Impact Bond Lab. And then for a time, had worked with a firm called Third Sector Capital Partners that was trying to adapt some of these new models coming up in the UK to the US. About 4 years ago, the Economic Development Board of Singapore helped to bring us over to Singapore to adapt these models to the Asian context. And actually, it was also because of the Asian context that pushed us to evolve the SIB model for some new use cases in this setting. So what I'd like to share today is two things. First, a general overview of why the SIG model is something that can help. And then secondly, dive into the specific example that we've launched recently. And to start with, in terms of the why, I'd like to tackle the question of, so why is it important to pay for outcomes in the first place? And to get there, perhaps you can start with the question. So, we've all been watching anxiously about COVID vaccines and needing to take a booster shot. So maybe I'd like everyone to consider this for a second. would you take a COVID vaccine that had not yet been approved by the FDA or some other credible authority? I think most people's intuition would probably be no. And the reason why they feel that is because the approval process is a scientific one. And in fact, they would be right to be a bit hesitant to take an unapproved vaccine. Because actually, when you look at the rate of success, when you do experimental evaluations, only about 1 in 10 interventions that start the clinical trial process actually end up being approved. Now, in recent years, this same method of doing experimentation has been applied to the social sciences as well. Excuse me. So in the medical field, there are many examples where very intuitive procedures have been overturned by clinical trials like this. And in the social sector and in the impact sector, a lot of studies have been done recently using the same clinical methodology on education training interventions, employment interventions, and development interventions. And the results actually seem to reflect the same rate of success. One of the most sophisticated evaluation ecosystems is in the US. And in the employment studies that the government has studied, about 75% of them have shown about weak or no positive effects. In education, that number is about 90%. And in the development world, Jay Pell at MIT has done a lot of reviews of microfinance. And actually, a lot of the touted benefits in terms of income improvements or schooling improvements haven't quite shown up yet in the actual data. But this is not to say that actually, all is lost, right? This is actually to say that there is that 1 in 10 and that 25% of interventions that are successful, and we should actually try to double down on those and make sure that we're funding that. Why this is especially important is because we've all heard about the $2.5 trillion a year SDG gap, and COVID has also stretched government budgets, even in places like Singapore. So we need to make sure that every dollar goes to where it can do the most impact. So that's the context in which the social impact guarantee occurs. So what it's doing is a 3-step process that in some ways is a flip of the traditional social impact bond sequence. So here's how it works. First, a set of impact funders, whether it's government, philanthropy, or aid agencies, fund a service provider. Very much like the normal situation today. The service provider does its thing, and throughout this process gets ongoing data-driven feedback to improve on its services. And the twist is step 3, where a third-party guarantor comes in and says, if the outcomes are not achieved, I'm willing to repay the impact funder. And from the impact funder's perspective, they can then use that money over and over again until they achieve the impact that they really want. So why is that interesting? Well, from the impact funder's perspective, you can make sure that every dollar goes to where it can have most impact. But from the guarantor's perspective, and you hear more from Pierre later, who was the guarantor, there are actually 2 ways in which this can improve the impact leverage and actually improve, for the more financially minded funders, improve their financial return. So the 2 sources of impact leverage from a funder's perspective are very much like that of an insurance company. So first, the funder dollars that are being used for the SIG don't actually need to be committed until the trigger occurs. So the funders can get the time value of money and actually invest that money in something else in the meantime. So the pool can keep growing. Second, there's the risk pooling effect, where for every dollar that you have, much like an insurance company, you only expect maybe 1 in 5 of your guarantees eventually to be called. So you could actually catalyze 5 times as much funding to effective interventions than if you were to fund it yourself. Now, for the financially minded funders, of course, the premium that the guarantor, the impact funder pays can also serve as a source of returns. And it's also possible in the meantime, because of the time value of money, to invest your money and get those market rate returns. So why this is interesting is because actually it could be a way in which we can scale the types of people who are participating in the SIV market today. So there are different estimates of how much the SIV market is, but overall it's been about $500 million over the last 10 years. In a related field, though, the catastrophe bond market, where in the climate space, investors are essentially providing insurance to companies and governments for similar types of adverse triggers, that market is actually 100 times bigger even today than the social impact bond market. So could we tap on this new group of people to scale up some of the core benefits of the social impact bond? And that's where I think there is some way in which we can tap on the SIG features. So here's the actual case study that we did in Singapore. So the SIG in Singapore was with the YMCA in the area of youth not in education, employment, or training. So in Singapore, generally employment is okay, but there's still about 5% of 15 to 29-year-olds who are unemployed. And many of those are also not in any sort of education program. So government had been funding this program by the community chest for about 10 years. But the YMCA CEO said to us, hey, you know, it's our 10th year anniversary. Let's try something different. Let's try to enhance the program. So what they found was that there were a few different challenges that the youth were facing, from a lack of professional experience to personal factors to needing more tailored support. And the YMCA had wanted to come up with a few new interventions to enhance the existing baseline, the internship, extended social intervention, and enhanced learning. And what they said was, if we can do these things, we actually think that we can get the success rate from about 62% historically to 75%. So what Pierre did here was he said, okay, you know, I'm willing to guarantee the YMCA to deliver that. And that allowed the YMCA to actually crowd in a new corporate funder for them to fund these enhancements. The YMCA will be delivering its enhancements. And then the Lorinet Foundation, in this case, has said that if the impact is not achieved, they'd be willing to give back the impact funder their money. Now, a twist in this case is that because the impact funder, say if it's government or foundations, often cannot receive the money back, they would actually just want the money to be recycled to another cause or to try again. And that's what Pierre will do with the instructions of the impact funder in this case. So apart from the benefits of bringing in more money, there are a few other benefits that occurred in this case. So first, there's the use of outcomes and rigorous evaluation. So to push the boundaries of what was done before. Oftentimes, nonprofits feel a bit nervous when we do that. So trying to de-risk that transition for them is very useful in getting the adoption of these outcomes. Second, there's the innovation component. So this allows the YMCA to try something new that otherwise traditional funding models might not have been willing to fund. And third, it brings in new types of players, both on the impact funder side, but also on the guarantor side. So here's the future that we see. We think that there might be three broad benefits. First, it could make the adoption of these models by newcomers easier, from governments and donors who often find it difficult to apply the SIB because it requires maybe special funding pots or innovation pots. This can be just a top up on top of things that they're already doing. Same for philanthropists who often can't take money and pay over multiple years, like in the social impact bond, but need to give out money every year. So they don't mind paying first and then getting the money back later. Or it could even be used by blended finance investors who are trying to attract concessionary capital in an increasingly crowded space. So that's on the first. Second, there are many new types of players who could be guarantors. Family officers, foundations, and impact investors who are able to grow their money because of the time value of money could benefit from this. Banks already issue letters of credit, so that could be a new source. And finally, of course, the insurers and reinsurers who have an extremely sophisticated machinery for measuring risk could enter this space and help funders also measure their risks and manage that in more detail. But actually, one of the biggest benefits of this will be to extend the use of outcomes-based funding beyond special innovation pots to mainstream funding. So maybe I'll close with an example. When I was back in the US, we launched from the biggest social impact bonds in the world. It was $36 million to do with jail. However, this $36 million was over 6 years, so about $6 million a year, on top of $1 billion a year government budget. So in reality, we're making a very small dent on a very big budget. So government actually said to us, hey, how do we take the learnings that you've got from the social impact bond, this small $6 million, and spread that over the $1 billion a year that we're spending, because that's where we're really going to make a difference. So the guarantee could be easily applied to any of these areas, and we can talk a bit more in the Q&A about some use cases that we've heard of. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and look forward to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Okay, I'd like to turn to Pierre as our panelist with the first question. And being the guarantor for this setup, can you please share your perspectives on what motivated you to participate and what kind of outcomes were you seeking in this process?
Sure. I think, from our perspective, and as a foundation, we are focused. We have obviously a topical focus, but we're also very much interested in impact and outcomes. And I think generally, when you look at the way philanthropy is done, still the majority of it in the world is still more focused on outputs, than outcomes. So when we look at one area that we're interested in, which is the one YMCA is working on, which is really around youth employment or reintegration of disadvantaged youth or disconnected youth into education or employment. Often people will look at training programs and look at how many people do you put through a training program. And that's great. I've put 1,000 kids through a training program, fantastic, done. Well, actually, it doesn't really matter how many kids you put through a training program. What matters is how many of them get a job or go back into education. So, everything that we do, whether it's through more pay for success type product or even just more straightforward philanthropy, we do look at outcomes and measure them over the period of time of our engagement. But I think what's particularly interesting within the SIG or pay for success is that the outcome is at the center of the structure and of the governance of the project. And so you really bring all the actors, all the players. I think Mara gave a very good presentation, about the sort of the funder, the service providers, and the person that pays for outcome. They all come together with to make sure that they measure and monitor and also work over time through the development of the project to measure the performance. So in this particular case for YMCA, we do have sort of monthly where we talk about how is it going, what's happening, what are the challenges that you're meeting, and so you get everybody around the table to really talk about the issues, try to chip in and work with them on seeing how things can be adapted to make sure we get to the right outcome. So there's a big focus on that outcome, and it's at the center. So I think for me, that's one of the attraction of these types of models. The other thing also, I think Kevin presented quite a few of them as a guarantor. If you have more flexibility, I mean, one of the issues that, let's say, social impact bonds have met, maybe more in sort of a, let's say, resource-rich country like Singapore, where you have enough money to fund a lot of the philanthropic activities or enough money to fund government programs. Trying to have something where actually you have a conditional payment, it doesn't fit into the budgeting cycles, the political cycle of all of this. So it makes it potentially unattractive, and then doesn't really push people to work towards this outcome-based product. So I think that the SIG, reversing it, makes it a lot easier, I think, as Kevin was saying, to adapt this to existing programs and budgetary constraints and everything. So I think for me, that's if we can demonstrate that it works at small scale, we can maybe apply it to the existing pool and really enhance and drive that outcome-driven approach across the sector and not just in sort of niche areas. So I think that's another attraction. The final one, I think, for me is leverage. I love the idea that you can you get your dollar to go further. And so with a guarantee, if you do deliver the outcome, well, I haven't spent anything. I can use it again and do it again. And actually, in the contract that we have, we have that commitment that if the guarantee doesn't get called because great YMCA has delivered the performance that we all expect, well, we'll do the next program, and then you get to do it again, and you really through that drive increased performance effectively. So those are some of the elements that I find very, very interesting.
Thanks for that, Pierre. And I think Mara also touched on the regular check-in mechanisms within her presentation earlier on as a way to keep the focus front and center on this whole aspect of outcomes. I think on a related topic and a question that came in from Grace in the chat box, and Kev, if I can turn over to you on this. We've expanded on the social impact guarantee model and spoken a lot about the different actors involved from a funding standpoint. I think Grace's question is, how does this impact innovativeness at the implementation level? How are we incentivizing different approaches to solving existing problems on the ground? Would love to hear from you on that.
Sure, happy to share that. And I'd say that there are many reasons why people come to this SIB tent. And every country I've worked in, you have a different reason. But innovativeness does seem to be one that is drawing people to it in Singapore and in Asia. So how we do it, I think, is in two ways. So at a mechanical level, a lot of the capacity building, close attention, and cross-sector expertise sharing that occurs in the SIB occurs here as well. So for example, say in the YMCA case, the ability for Pierre as the guarantor to share all of his foundation's expertise in giving around the world with the YMCA is very useful for the YMCA to decide how exactly it can come up with new programs. Likewise, there are certain incentives in the contract, in this case, that try to encourage them to do better. So for example, if they are not trying, if they don't call the guarantee because they managed to innovate and succeed, then actually there's a re-guarantee next year. But I think more broadly, beyond the mechanics of it, there's also, I think, a sandbox mentality that occurs here that's a little bit different from usual. It's as much a human thing as it is a mechanical thing. So I think having a special container like this, where everyone's expecting you to innovate or giving you the space really to try new things, and even if you don't succeed, it's okay. You're not seen as a bad nonprofit. I think that's really important for the nonprofit to try new things. So I think there are both mechanical and human ways in which this has helped the nonprofit try something new.
Thanks for that, Kev. And a question for Mara. I think around the market size that you shared earlier on, wondering what proportion you're seeing coming out of Asia, and what might be, in your opinion, some factors withholding the growth of this market on the Asia front. We'd love to hear from you on that.
Okay, first, there might be many more than are on our data set. So our data set is sourced with information that is currently available. And in fact, it's great. I'm linking up with Cedric, who might have more instruments in his data set. We started doing a review of instruments being used and expanding the terminology, the terms of these instruments. We work with a team of about 40 policy advisors that use impact bond type instruments, and we came up with 65 different terms that refer to similar yet different approaches. So it is possible that in Asia, the terminology is different. We don't use impact bond. It is possible that there is a language barrier. So I know there are more projects in Japan than the one that I list in my project, just because they are rarely translated in English. So my machine learning instrument that picks up project doesn't pick up some Asian one. But I think it's just, it's also a matter of readiness of a particular system. So many of these projects are in the UK. There has been a lot of political commitment and emphasis and incentive to launch this sector. It didn't happen grassroots. So a lot of resources have been put in by central government, also in the US now with the outcome funds. When you put resources in a sector, many projects come up. I think I haven't seen these as much in Asia. In India is moving in that direction. More are coming up, but in terms of another project in Singapore, in Hong Kong. So send them to me. The reason they're not there probably is just because we are humans and we are not picking them up. But the reason there are so many in the UK is a central government drive.
I see. And maybe questions for, excuse me, Kevin and Pierre, to expand a bit more about what you see as factors that could encourage more adoption of the SIG model within Singapore and beyond. Yeah, and if you could maybe spend a bit of time to share with all of us how the initial conceptualization of this idea came about. I think in the Q&A, Tista was looking to sort of understand a bit more about, you know, what sort of serendipity was required to get all these different parties on the same page and be open to collaborating like this.
Kevin, do you want to start? Okay. I'm sure Kevin has more to say about this than me, but I think, I mean, in terms of to your last question around that, I think it was, you know, I've been working with Kevin pretty much since he came back, you know, initially more as an advisor and you know, supporting the effort because I was interested in sort of in the SIB sector. And I think he's been very driven into trying to see how he could adapt the model to really get traction in places like Singapore and other locations in Asia, because obviously there may be, like you say, you know, there may be cultural differences, there may be you know, certain things that don't fit quite the model here. And so I think through various discussion, Kevin and his team came up with this notion of SIG, which then we, you know, he sort of tested me, and I've worked in my background, I've had to deal, I didn't work in insurance, but I used a lot of insurance. So I'm relatively cognizant of the issues and the in and out of how insurance works and what it can do. And therefore, through that, you know, constant sort of brainstorming back and forth, I guess we all came up with something that we thought would make sense. And I said, you know, if you think that can work, I'm happy to support it. So that was the serendipity. So it started from that, from basically the tri-sector and myself brainstorming, and then me saying I'm willing to support that because I think there's some interesting possibilities. And then after that, I think it's all Kevin and Tri-Sector who basically went and found people, you know, the service provider, the funder, and everyone else to make it stick and make it happen. So I think that's credit to the team at Tri-Sector. So that's how we started. In terms of, I guess the first part of the question, if you can remind me, Kevin,
yeah,
how to scale, basically, how to scale this.
Yeah. So from this experience, you know, and what we've learned, how can we get other service providers to be open to this and other funders to come in and support similar mechanisms?
I think I'll just do one or two things and I'll let Kevin know because he's far more versed into that than me. But I think for me, first of all, we need to complete this one and hopefully it works and we're successful, because I think success always, you know, breeds replication, I guess. So while, you know, I think Kevin is right in the sense that there's no good or bad outcome. It's not, you know, the fact that the guarantee gets paid is in a way is presented as a positive outcome. It works. You know, they didn't deliver, we paid back the guarantee and we could try again for another program. So there's no real bad outcome per se. Obviously, we all hope that we deliver or maximize the number of people who do get back into jobs, and that would be the best outcome. But you know, if we get this to work and we can present it, I think one way to get others to replicate or look at joining the effort is really because you are drawing on additional pools of funding and you are improving the outcomes for the beneficiaries. And to the extent that a lot of the actors in the field, or the majority of them, are really driven by the impact that they want to give. You know, they want to do good and they want to improve livelihoods or outcomes for their beneficiaries. If you can demonstrate that through that process, not only do you get more funding, you also, with the governance around the project and the focus on achieving better outcomes, you get there. I think that in itself is a great proof and should get the majority of people at least interested. The practicalities of then scaling is you know, it takes time and finding, again, the right parties. You know, you need multiple parties, so you need to gel or make that group gel. So I'll stop here and head over to Kevin.
Thanks. Yeah, you know, to me, the answer to both of those questions is incentives. So as to why it's difficult to scale, or how we get it to scale, it's really about whoever is funding things wanting to see the outcomes. And oftentimes, for example, in government, the incentives that are driving the people who are spending the money a few ministries down might not be the same as the people who actually own the money. So for example, the Ministry of Finance or the Tote Board in Singapore might disperse the money to an agency whose subsequent role is to figure out how to spend it, right? So the way this might scale is if the original owners of the money actually say, hey, you know, I want more bang for my buck. And then that will then catalyze a shift towards how do we actually get there. So central government action, as Mara mentioned, I think is really important for this kind of outcomes-based financing to occur, or central, whoever owns the funds needs to want it. Likewise, too, as to the genesis of this SIG concept, actually. So I can't claim all the credit for having come up with this. Actually, the first mention of this idea was 14 years ago by my old mentor at Third Sector, where he talked about what he called the outcomes guarantor model at a conference in the US. And it basically had the same features as a SIG. And then there was a senator in the audience who basically said to him, hey, you know, that was a good presentation, but it'll never happen, don't do it. And then the SIB was launched and so on. And the reason why that was the case is because the hook with the SIB in some parts of the US and the UK at first was that government in the short run didn't have money, and the ability to have investors put up money to finance some preventative measures was attractive to them. So the fact that the guarantee took existing money and spent it better was not a sufficient hook for government to want to do it. But coming back to Asia, actually that was the problem's a bit reversed. You know, government in Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, runs a budget surplus. They can raise money very cheaply on the normal bond market. So why would they want to raise money via social impact bond? That said, they really like the fact that it pays for outcomes. They like the fact that it brings on the private sector to capacity build the non-profits. So how do we get that side of the social impact bond, the insurance, risk transfer, capacity building, without necessarily the borrowing side of things? So I think that's in a way why the SIG model ended up being something that people kind of intuitively understood here. And the SIB model was one that took off first in the US. So I think that may be a more macro way of why the incentives align in different ways in different countries. But you know, it's a fascinating question.
Thanks for that, Kev. And I think, you know, as you've described, that there is the layering of budgets from the central agency down to ministries to implementing agencies, and that's where you've got different granularity of considerations around outcomes. I mean, it goes from very broad to very specific. And what I see here is sort of, you know, in the SIG implementation with YMCA, you've got a bit of a grassroots type response to that situation to say, you know, given this unit of analysis, how do we optimize it and make it more effective? And in a way, try to flow that aspect upstream to the other players. And what I'm curious about is in your conversations with the different public agencies, if you could, and also for Mara, right, as you analyze sort of SIP across the board, where you have agencies that could be sort of bureaucratic in nature, and they are large, they subdivide into specific roles. How do we get this shift in the mindset from the outputs piece, which is sort of what I assume is the predominant reality today, towards outcomes, and in a way that connects well to the ground realities? You know, all these social issues are the current reality. That's what people live with. How do we use these mechanisms to better connect that into higher order decision making? Would love to hear from all of you on this.
I can take a stab because I think this is really a big question. The change of mind, often like when we see description of impact bonds, there is consensus that is a sort of Trojan horse. Like you don't want to have more impact bonds for the sake of having more impact bonds, but you really want to shift the mindset towards having a focus on outcome, having this use of real-time information to change decisions and accelerate the achievements of outcomes. So there is this mindset change. And often government are the ones who are said they don't move fast enough. This is too innovative, it's too scary, there are procedures, there is a big bureaucracy. And in part, that's true. Like bureaucracy have been created because due process is important. You don't have somebody who comes as an innovator. So the fact that there are quite like strict jackets and procedures serves a purpose. But then it also leads to some inertia and some delays. I found that among the interesting projects that I've been observing are the ones that involve government earlier on. And they are at the table from the beginning. So I was reviewing the results of the Kangaroo Mother Care Development Impact Bond recently, just completed. And this project was designed to test the rollout of an intervention for new mothers. So just before they give birth and just after they gave birth, to reduce maternal mortality and infant mortality. It is something that has been tested through a randomized control trial in a different country, in a different place. Will it work in Cameroon? Will it work in different type of hospital when we don't have private clinics? And what they did, they had government at the table from day one, because government should have carried it on. And sometimes it takes longer. And if you look at the experience of Latin America, same thing. They always say having government at the table at the beginning seems scary. It's already long to design an impact bond. If you have government at the table, it takes even longer. But it will be taken on and will be implemented afterwards. Because often we forget, what happens once the impact bond is finished? Sometimes like, oh, it's a project that has a start and an end. At the end of it, there is another impact bond. Really? If it was done for innovation, then maybe the innovation is taken up in mainstream delivery. So if you have government at the table, the conversation of what happens at the end is much more mature. And so it's an investment that you make, but you need to brace yourself for that. And everybody needs to learn new ways of working with various players. But what is interesting of the social impact guarantee is that it's not as big a stretch for government to engage with it, because the deployment of funding is what looks familiar. Usual procedures, the procurement, like they know how to do those things, and you're not asking them to pay for outcome. The contract looks the same, it will look familiar. And I find it interesting because it will help us, in some cases, get over that resistance, like two different, I don't know what it is, and there is just a sort of insurance mechanism and other things they are familiar with. So I think I have hopes of government faster, because it's a more familiar instrument and is closer to what is familiar to them.
That's great to hear, and it always helps to bridge sort of different sectors or segments together, right? I mean, if you can find that common ground, and in a way that is somewhat familiar and perhaps non-threatening, I think that's a good basis for getting things going. Pierre and Kevin, just would love to hear from you in terms of what it felt like in the onset.
Yeah, I mean, I think to on what Mara is saying, I think ultimately all of this, and I see it in other works that we do, it's about impact, and impact means ability to scale. And obviously, as we all know, I mean, there's two things. I think Kevin mentioned one. First of all, we all know that a majority of intervention, while being nice, don't have the impact that they think they have. And so, in a way, social impact bonds or SIGs are here to try to wean out what are the ones that really work, because they deliver on and are measured and monitored throughout and deliver. And so, where do we spend our money going forward? And that's why I think Mara's very right. I think if you have an impact bond and it works, ideally government or somebody else with deep pockets should be taking that methodology over and then rolling it out, because there's still money being spent on various programs, some that don't work, and that's really a pity in a way. So that's to me, that's one element. And I think that the government point, in our foundation, everything we do, we're always thinking, how do we embed it ultimately? And it's not always depending where you work, and a big part of our work is in Mongolia, not an easy place to involve government from day one. But it is essential if you want to achieve, even if you don't do a SIG or a SID, to achieve scalability down the road, particularly when you touch around like education, employment, things like that. The only ones who can really roll out on scale today are governments. Ultimately, we have enough, the deepest pockets, so it's essential.
Thanks, Pierre. Well, I second very much what both Mara and Pierre said. And I also add that I think value alignment is also really important. So one of the great benefits of the SIG and SIB tools is that they seem to contain something for everyone. There is a certain flexibility in it that allows it to add different types of value in different contexts. So for example, in the Singaporean context with SIBs, for example, even for agencies where actually it's not about getting more outcomes or about spending money better, there is still value because of the intrinsic desire to involve the private sector to risk share, or also to have them build the capabilities of the nonprofits. And what we can do is we can think soberly about, in each of these different contexts, whether in Singapore, in the development world, and so on, what exactly is the problem that the private sector or the guarantors or the data-driven nature of this tool can help solve, and think about how can we actually make that more apparent around the narrative. So we're talking now about this outcomes-based measures because we are in the audience of funders. But when we talk to government, the value proposition might be very different altogether. So we just have to be cognizant that this tool will be modified and the narrative around it will be modified, and that's okay. And that's actually a good thing. So I think that's very important as we try and bring this to scale.
Thanks for that, Kev. A couple of questions around, maybe if you can remind us again, what KPIs were tracked as part of the inaugural SIG and how those were agreed upon. And then I think Diana in the chat had a question on whether the SIG structure could be applied to other asset classes like microfinance or private credit. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah. So the first one I think is quite straightforward. So what we looked at here was the number of youth who are placed in education or employment, but only above the baseline that was the historical baseline. So if you recall, this program has been going on for about 10 years, and we saw about a 62% success rate. So what's being guaranteed is the delta on top of that between 62 and 75. And how we set those targets was a combination of research in the baseline, analysis of similar interventions, and also some degree of negotiation between parties. About whether or not it could be applied to other asset classes, I do think so. Look, the idea of a guarantee in general is not new. Guarantees have been applied by development agencies on the financial side. So for example, saying that if you make a microfinance loan and it doesn't get repaid, I'll pay you back, right? So that's a financial guarantee. The innovation here is that this is the guarantee that guarantees impact, that if you don't achieve the impact side of things, we'll pay you back. So to the extent to which that is the gap in microfinance, perhaps, I think where there might be a bigger gap is in the creation of these blended finance funds that I think is being talked a lot about. The private sector is looking to get concessionary capital to try to enhance its returns, de-risk itself. But of course, everybody wants that. So why should this concessionary pot fund you rather than somebody else? And perhaps the guarantee could be a way in which you could say to the concessionary funders, hey, you know, we will guarantee that you will get impact if you give us your capital in this way. So perhaps that might be a way in which that occurs. But to my earlier point, I think the incentives for everybody need to align.
Okay, sounds good. We're coming up to the hour, and thanks to everyone for the many questions you've submitted through the Q&A widget as well as through the chat dialogue. Maybe for our panelists, I'm just would love to see what you would like to share as a parting thought with our close to 100 participants today from the funder ecosystem, some of them from government agencies, as to how you might like them to engage with you on social impact guarantees, and also share with us one hope that you have around this exciting new development that is now out and growing. So we'll start with Mara, then Pierre, then Kev.
So if I can use this platform, for me, the challenge is sharing information and the learning. Often we develop this innovative mechanism, and many people are reinventing a flat wheel. So the social impact guarantee might be a great success. Let's learn from it, but it would be helpful to see in the public domain a lot of information in terms of feasibility study, redacted contracts, because everybody is investing a lot of resources in getting these innovative initiative launched. The obvious way to reduce the transaction cost is sharing what we've done and copying from each other. So please allow people to plagiarize your work.
Thanks, Mara. Pierre?
Yeah, I think I'll take the cue from one of the question. I think that the last question that came around the risk for the guarantors and if there's a premium. I mean, I think the risk obviously is that everyone fails and you get to pay out every time, and that's not a risk in itself, but it certainly could be a challenge financially to manage within the work of the foundation. So I think and the corollary to that is, so is there a premium? There should be a premium. The structure of the program means there is a premium. But in this particular case, because we're piloting and we're innovating in a way, we decided to forego that premium. But I think for these products to work down the road, you need to be able to utilize your risk for guarantors to have an incentive to continue doing this. So you need these products to be replicated in different fields, which are somewhat decorrelated. And therefore, then you can start charging a reasonable premium. Sorry, my phone just started to ring in my ears. You need to effectively charge a reasonable premium. And then because you're mutualized, the reality is you can commit a certain amount of capital and still, make it work-wise from a financial perspective, and therefore scale down the road. And that would be my hope, that more people replicate it, that you can start developing an ecosystem of guarantors that see actually a financial benefit in doing this while attaining a good social outcome.
Thanks for that, Pierre. And Kev?
Thanks. Likewise, I'll take a cue from a question that asks, how does your organization define impact versus outcomes? My wish is for funders to ask for more. I think the word outcomes is a very abused word. Everybody believes that they are tracking outcomes and paying on outcomes today. But actually, most of the time, that's not the case. What we call outcomes are really outputs. What I'd like, if I had a magic wand, would be for the more central, whoever is dispersing the funds, who is paying for impact, to really unpack what they mean by outcomes, see what really matters for the beneficiaries, and then if there's a way in which this can be a way to transition to higher outcomes, push from outputs to outcomes, or build the capacity of the provider, try and give it a go.
Thanks for that, Kevin. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today on the webinar. Thanks to Mara, Pierre, and Kevin for sharing deep insights into the world's first social impact guarantee. I think the future looks bright for the outcomes management space, and encourage as many of you to join us in this journey to progress it further. So see you again. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.